Let's bring in now our Thursday panel of party commentators. Susan Smith is a Liberal commentator, Tim Powers a Conservative commentator, and Robin MacLachlan is an NDP commentator. Good to see you all.
Good to see you.
Another busy week since last time we talked, and we're back. Let's start with the same thing I think we were talking about last week, and that's the blockades and the impasse over the Coastal GasLink pipeline. Movement we're seeing now in terms of conversations and discussions and negotiations. What's at stake in all of this for the Prime Minister, Susan?
Well, I think the peaceful operation of the country, as well as continued economic confidence in the country. The Prime Minister, I mean, this has been a complicated, fraught situation. I think it's unfortunately for Prime Minister Trudeau, 150 years of boiling over mistakes and pent-up resentment is happening on his watch. And I don't think you can say he's responsible for it. I think it's just been a point that it's bubbled over again. It has at many other times. I think what's important and what the Prime Minister is now trying to do and people are trying to do is divide this into the two issues that it actually is. The first is the Coastal Gas pipeline, declaring that I do some work for the company, one of the companies that are proponents there, but just from an observational perspective, the first thing is the Wet'suwet'en have to solve what their issues are. The second is how to address the long-standing grievances that people have from a reconciliation process. I think you're seeing more movement to splitting these two issues. There's a meeting with the ministers, BC and Canada, with the chiefs in Wet'suwet'en today. And then there's a First Minister's meeting coming down the road. So I think there's starting to be opportunities for the discussions to be pulled apart in a good way. So the issue of the trajectory of the pipeline and whether it progresses and how it progresses, and the issue of reconciliation can be tackled two different ways.
Okay, First Minister's coming up on the 12th and 13th of March with Indigenous leaders on day one, and then the First Minister's on day two. Tim, how do you see this? And I mean, I suppose a lot hinges on where these discussions go in Smithers, BC, as to whether or not it looks like the Prime Minister's strategy was the right strategy or whether it starts to fall apart.
Well, where you can ascribe blame to the Prime Minister that's not helping this circumstance because it's led to this frustration that Susan's talked about is inflating expectations, not in the immediate term, but early days of his election, he talked about making Indigenous reconciliation a front and center issue. As noble as that is to say, because of that very 150-year history, you couldn't get that done in 4 or 5 years. And I think there were a lot of Indigenous leaders and First Nation groups who thought more things would be done now. So park that for the moment. In terms of the management of this, it's a tough one. I think you got to give him credit and all the leaders credit, the provincial leaders and different Indigenous leaders, for at least so far there not being any violence, there not being any bloodshed, and things are slowly starting to come back to normal. Having worked in the Indigenous arena as an Indigenous negotiator, the same rules don't apply, and not everybody understands that. I think, though, the final point on all of this is the polls are showing the Prime Minister is wearing this, fairly or unfairly. That's the nature of politics.
We saw an Angus Reid poll earlier in our show that
only
20% of Canadians
that show the Conservatives are ahead by 5% for whatever that's worth.
And Angus Reid says today 20% of Canadians think he's doing a good job handling this.
Yeah, and so those aren't great numbers. So he needs things like the First Minister's meetings, like the budget, and an ongoing peaceful resolution to this to help change the channel for him.
Robin, what do you think?
Well, you asked about the Prime Minister's strategy, and I'll start by saying this is not an easy situation. I don't have the answers to this, but the problem I think for many of the Canadians looking and themselves perhaps not knowing the answer, do look to the Prime Minister to resolve this. And I don't know that there really was a coherent strategy. From the start, he was saying this is a provincial issue. So the pipeline's within BC. Yes, that means that it has jurisdiction over the approval of the pipeline. But that doesn't mean because it involves Indigenous peoples, then it is a federal issue. And it was as far back as 1993 that a process was set up to try to help resolve the outstanding treaty issues for BC in particular. And out of the 30-odd First Nations bands, there's only 3 treaties that have been signed. The Wet'suwet'en are not one of those. So to Susan's point, the long-standing issue is the reason this current issue is so problematic, because we have not as a country, successive governments, resolved a system to allow allow us to have treaties in place that would make this a lot easier to sort out. So the Prime Minister, though, went from saying it wasn't federal jurisdiction to saying that dialogue is important and to asking for patience. 4 days later, saying the blockades must come down, and then seeing OPP roll in. I think that kind of disconnect and has been hard for Canadians to follow and say that this person who has elevated expectations, as Tim said, doesn't seem to have a strategy in place.
I think when you have 150 years of things not going right, in fact, things going very wrong, you can't fix them overnight. I don't think Prime Minister Trudeau ever said he was going to fix them overnight. He just said we're going to tackle the problems that we've had, and this is a priority for me.
He did say, I think it was in February of 2018, he did pledge that the government was going to finally tackle the issues around treaty rights and
Sure.
and what's really at the center of the dispute
Sure.
today. And the chiefs will say that almost nothing's been done
But
on that in 2
well,
years.
And his
it's a
former
very
minister has been highly
complicated-
critical of that.
Well,
too.
it's a very, I mean, I've said before on the show, Peter, there's no playbook on what to do. There's certainly a lot of playbooks on what not to do when you look at Oka and Ipperwash and Caledonia and other ones of these things. It is provincial jurisdiction. The police are enforcing the law. We don't live in a country where our politicians tell our police what to do. But it goes back to, Robin, to your point, the initial, I don't want to say conflict, but the initial issue here is within the Wet'suwet'en community themselves. It's the hereditary chiefs, some hereditary chiefs who don't approve the route of the gas pipeline despite the consultations, despite the sign-ons, and the elected chiefs who do. They actually have an internal dispute that they have to resolve themselves. Ideally, the majority voice would come and say, please stand down from these blockades.
But the internal dispute stems from the fact that they're conflicted over the rights and positions taken by the elected band councils under the Indian Act, which is rejected by the hereditary chiefs, because they have a much longer standing traditional right to make decisions about the use of their territory.
And I'm far from an expert.
Which the Supreme Court has upheld.
And I'm not even close to an expert on the local Indigenous politics and the hereditaries versus the electeds. But what I do know is that the majority of the Wet'suwet'en community are supportive of this. There are more than 20 bands that have been consulted with for 7 years. There's impact benefits agreements. And there are chiefs and communities and matriarchs, even in the hereditary chiefs, that are saying, we're tired of managing poverty. We want our communities to have opportunity. We want it to be done the right way. We want it to be done environmentally.
Where we might be, Tim, at the end of this conversation, and I've heard it from, and earlier in our program, we had two of the Indigenous chiefs, First Nations chiefs, one chief and one representative from Ganawagi talking about, at the end of the day, if it means the bottom line is rerouting the pipeline, that's the probably immovable demand from the hereditary chiefs. How does a government react to that? How does BC react to that in order to try and resolve this situation when the company said, we're not interested in rerouting it?
Well, you're going to reroute a pipeline. I'm, again, not an expert at pipelines, but I can guess it's going to cost in the hundreds of millions of dollars to do for all sorts of reasons, new consultations.
But governments are going to have to make a call on whether they support that notion or whether they take the side
that
of
would set a very dangerous precedent. I suspect it will end up going back to another form of court to adjudicate. I suspect the federal government, as they did in other pipeline disputes and other resource disputes, would try and find a third party, i.e. a court, to rule on all of that. But again, back to the question, Justin Trudeau, I think it was that inflation of expectations that has led to the problems he's had with the way people are viewing his leadership here. Again, whether that's fair or not, I think that's what's happened. Susan's right in how she describes the internal dynamics of the Wet'suwet'en, but that isn't what Canadians are looking at to the degree. They see their prime minister, they see rail lines being blockaded, they hear premiers saying you need to act. They aren't listening to jurisdiction or Indigenous politics. They're looking at a prime minister who promised to do better on this front and hasn't, and that's why he's suffering.
But I mean, I think to suggest that it's up to the Wet'suwet'en to sort out what they want here isn't respecting the situation that we've created as a colonial, in our colonial past. So whether we like it or not, the hereditary system, as you noted off the top, for the Wet'suwet'en is the historic system, and the Supreme Court has upheld that they have the right to determine what happens within their territory. And that's a territory of 22,000 square kilometers area. The elected chiefs have control over the
whatever
bands
parcel of land,
35 square kilometer area, and they're there to govern for law and order in that territory. So to say that it's not, they didn't do their job, I think it's much more fair to say that obviously the consultation was not thorough enough if there seems to be this discord between the people that have the Supreme Court and upheld
That's not
announcement.
true, Robin.
Excuse
Just
me, I'm not
because-
done talking yet. But I'm just saying that it's the federal government can't choose whether the pipeline's right or the people are right. It must set up a process that allows this to be resolved. It can't pick sides.
But the process is there, and I think it's important to know that the consultation did take place. For 7 years it took place. But what happens, as within every society, not everybody agrees. I mean,
unfortunately,
nowhere
people
in
that
this
have
country
but
has there ever
but
been
the
100%
and
agreement
the
on anything,
hereditary
except
chiefs
perhaps if it's
opposed to
snowing
it
hard
have
in
been
Ottawa.
saying for those 7 years, they were the voice saying, you're not putting this through our
It
territory.
wasn't the same group because they turfed 3 of the matriarch chiefs, 3 of the women who were part of it. So there's all kinds of internal dynamics that's complicated. I don't understand it from an external perspective. What I do understand is there are 2 issues at play. We have to get back to trying to separate them. One, enabling the Wet'suwet'en community to decide for themselves who speaks for them. Right? Is it the hereditary chiefs? Is it the elected chiefs? Allow them to come to the conclusion that they want. And then separately, and this is, I think, with having Indigenous leaders as part of the First Minister's thing, continuing to deal with the issue of reconciliation and what it takes to move that bar.
And I guess in some ways it might be a brave move to call a First Ministers Conference less than a month from now, where this may or may not be resolved.
I actually think it's the right move.
Well, it's either a chance
It's not the only issue. I
no.
think Jason Kenney's going to have some other
Well, I was just going to
issues.
say, I mean, if the idea is to try and get back to an agenda you can control, I'm not sure the First Ministers meeting will give them that opportunity.
I think that number one thing on the agenda is what's going on the blockades at the moment. If the Prime Minister has said, we want to listen to Indigenous leaders, please come to the table here, I think that's an important piece. The guy's never shied away from a tough meeting. He walks into tough crowds all the time. That's not going to be an issue. It's worse, I think, if it doesn't get addressed. So I think the FMM, whether it goes well or doesn't go well, is the right thing to do.
But let's be hopeful that these talks that are currently happening now, that are going to happen over the next few days, are fruitful. The hereditary chiefs have put 3 issues on the table that need to be resolved: RCMP presence, obviously the construction, and the police are not doing patrols on those areas. If there's movement on those issues, then perhaps a process can be put in place so that, to Susan's point, that the Wet'suwet'en will be able to have a voice and that will be heard in this process. And I think that the Prime Minister is going to wear this, and I think a First Minister's meeting is a good step. I'm just saying I'm not sure that it's going to succeed in changing the channel for the government.
Quick final word on
Yeah, well, as Robin alluded to earlier, the First Minister's meeting is also going to have to deal with climate and energy and finding a balance there, and who knows where we'll be with the issue of COVID-19 at that juncture as it spreads and causes greater concern around the world. So it won't be the only issue. There's a lot of issues there that they're all going to have to deal with.
All right, thanks very much. Talk to you later.
Thank you.
Thank you.